Rain silvered the cathedral steps and turned the arriving carriages into blurred silhouettes beneath trembling lantern light. Guests lifted their hems and hurried beneath umbrellas, laughter rising in brittle notes that shattered against the stone. Inside, chandeliers bloomed like captured constellations, scattering warmth across white roses braided with gold ribbon. The organ murmured a patient hymn, and the air smelled of wax, lilies, and expectation. Every pew gleamed with polished reverence. Every whisper knew precisely where to travel. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb stood near the rear aisle, gloved hands folded so tightly that the lace trembled. Her gown was modest dove gray, chosen to offend no eye and invite no notice, yet notice gathered around her like frost. She kept her gaze lowered, studying the faint reflection of candlelight upon the marble floor as if it were safer than faces. The invitation had arrived in heavy cream paper, scripted with a kindness too deliberate to be sincere. She had accepted because refusal would have confirmed the gossip. Attendance at least allowed dignity to pretend. Ahead, the bride's family occupied the front pews in pastel splendor, their smiles arranged like porcelain. A few heads turned with careful curiosity, then away again, as though acknowledging a minor stain upon an otherwise immaculate morning. Eleanor heard her name breathed between fans and gloved fingertips. She felt it rather than understood it, a small tug at the edges of her composure. Once, those same lips had praised her grace, her gentle manners, her suitability. Now they savored the spectacle of her endurance. At the altar stood Mr. Harold Benton, immaculate in black, his posture a study in practiced confidence. He did not look toward the rear. He did not need to. The knowledge of her presence was a quiet victory he permitted himself without glancing back. Months ago, he had withdrawn his proposal with polite regret and efficient finality, citing prospects and alliances that required a brighter dowry and a more advantageous name. His words had been courteous, their effect merciless. Today, his happiness paraded beneath vaulted ceilings, and she was invited to witness it. The bride entered on her father's arm in a froth of ivory satin and orange blossoms. A murmur of admiration rose, sincere and delighted. Eleanor felt it pass through her like a draft through an unlatched window. She admired the girl's youth, her untested confidence, the way she lifted her chin as though the world had always been inclined to agree with her. No resentment stirred in Eleanor, only a thin ache of displacement. She had once imagined that measured walk, that gentle hush, that future shaped by vows. A woman behind her leaned close to another and whispered, not softly enough, "How brave she is to attend." The reply came, syrupy with pity, "Or how foolish." Eleanor's spine straightened by a degree so small it might have been imagined. She adjusted her gloves with deliberate care. If she must be observed, she would offer them nothing crude to observe. Her breathing found a rhythm with the organ's cadence. She counted the notes to keep her thoughts from straying into memory's more treacherous corridors. Vows began. Words about constancy and devotion floated outward, gilded and harmless to those who had not been injured by their absence. Eleanor watched the candles bow and straighten with tiny draughts, and she felt her resolve do the same. She would endure this hour. She would leave with her composure intact. Later, alone, she might allow herself the small luxury of grief. Here she would be impeccable. Here she would be unassailable. A child dropped a program. The paper skittered across the aisle like a startled bird. The sound drew several glances, and with them came another wave of attention that brushed against Eleanor's stillness. She did not move to help. She did not trust her hands. Instead, she lifted her eyes for the first time and looked toward the altar. Harold's profile, familiar and distant, sharpened beneath the light. She wondered, briefly, whether he remembered the evenings spent discussing books by the fire, the promises made in gardens scented with late roses. His expression offered no answer. The organ swelled. Rings were exchanged. Applause rose, polite and sustained. Eleanor felt the applause as a pressure against her ribs. She allowed herself one slow breath that tasted faintly of lilies and melted wax. This, then, was the culmination of whispers and invitations, of glances designed to measure her reaction. She gave them none. She stood as a statue might stand, admired for its restraint rather than its feeling. Then the cathedral doors opened once more with a low, resonant groan that seemed to interrupt the applause without asking permission. Cool air slipped inside, carrying the scent of rain and iron. Heads turned as one, curiosity startled into silence. A figure paused upon the threshold, tall and spare, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. He removed his hat with unhurried precision, as though time answered to him rather than the reverse. Recognition moved through the pews like a ripple through silk. The Duke of Rathbourne had not been expected. He had not been invited. Stories clung to his name: discipline, reserve, a temperament as austere as winter fields. He rarely attended society celebrations and never without purpose. Now he stood beneath the chandeliers, composed and inscrutable, his gaze sweeping the congregation with a calm that unsettled more than spectacle could have done. Eleanor felt the change before she understood it. The room's attention shifted, recalibrated, and in that quiet reordering she sensed herself included in a new equation. She did not lift her head. She could not. The air seemed to tighten, threads drawing toward an unseen center. Footsteps sounded along the aisle, measured and deliberate, echoing faintly against stone. Conversations died mid-breath. Even the bride's laughter faltered into curiosity. She told herself the Duke would pass her by. She told herself his interest lay elsewhere, in courtesy or obligation or some errand too elevated for her comprehension. Yet the footsteps did not recede. They approached with the steady inevitability of rain. Eleanor's pulse counted them against her will. 1, 2, 3. She fixed her gaze upon the marble once more, willing it to be enough. The footsteps stopped directly before her. A pause, dignified and absolute, settled between them like a held note. Eleanor felt, with sudden clarity, the weight of a gaze resting upon her bowed head, not appraising, not amused, but attentive. Around them, the cathedral seemed to lean inward. She sensed the bride's confusion, the groom's stiffening surprise, the congregation's sharpened curiosity. Still she did not look up. And then, with a voice low and even as distant thunder, the Duke spoke her name. Eleanor's name, spoken in that measured baritone, seemed to travel farther than the cathedral walls, reaching into places she had carefully sealed against memory. She lifted her eyes at last and found the Duke standing before her, rain still jeweled upon the dark wool of his coat. His expression was not stern, as rumor insisted, nor kind, as she had secretly hoped, but composed with a gravity that permitted no misunderstanding. Around them, the applause had thinned into a hush attentive as snowfall. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, inclining his head with courtly precision, "might I request the honor of your company for a moment?" The formality of the words carried a quiet defiance, as though he were restoring a balance no one else had noticed was broken. Eleanor felt every gaze settle upon her shoulders. She sensed the bride's confusion sharpen into irritation, the groom's posture stiffen with affront. Yet the Duke waited, patient and unyielding, his gloved hand extended in invitation rather than command. Her fingers trembled before they obeyed. She placed them lightly upon his sleeve, and a collective murmur fluttered through the pews like startled birds. The contact was decorous, nearly distant, but the implication rang louder than any impropriety. He guided her toward the aisle with unhurried steps, neither shielding her from attention nor offering her to it. The balance of his presence seemed to create a small, dignified corridor through which she could pass without shrinking. They did not speak until they reached the vestibule, where candlelight softened into amber shadows and the scent of rain returned. Eleanor withdrew her hand at once, uncertain of the rules that governed this unexpected rescue. The Duke removed his gloves with deliberate care, as though buying time for words that required precision. When he looked at her, it was with a steadiness that asked nothing and promised something she could not yet name. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said quietly. "I find myself intolerant of certain spectacles when they presume upon a lady's fortitude." The gentleness of the rebuke startled her. She realized he was not apologizing to the room but to her. Eleanor felt a warmth rise beneath her composure, unfamiliar and disarming. "Your Grace is most considerate," she replied, her voice carefully even, though her pulse betrayed her with bright insistence. From the nave beyond, the congregation began to move toward the reception hall, their curiosity rekindled by this unscripted moment. The Duke glanced toward the sound, then back to her. "They will expect us presently," he observed. "May I escort you?" The request, simple and impeccably phrased, carried the weight of public endorsement. Eleanor understood that refusal would return her to isolation. Acceptance would place her squarely at the center of attention. She inclined her head in assent. The reception glittered with crystal and candle fire, laughter rising in polite crescendos. Couples formed bright constellations across the polished floor as musicians tuned their strings. When the Duke entered with Eleanor upon his arm, conversation faltered, then reassembled itself into excited whispers. Heads leaned together like conspirators. The bride's smile wavered at the edges, and Harold Benton watched from across the room with a displeasure he could not disguise. The Duke did not hurry. He led Eleanor directly onto the dance floor with the same composure he had shown in the cathedral. "You may refuse me," he said softly, pausing at the edge of the waltzing couples. "But I should be honored if you did not." The faintest suggestion of humor touched his tone, and for the first time since morning, Eleanor felt the ghost of a smile answer it. She placed her hand in his, aware that the entire room leaned toward them in anticipation. They began to move with measured grace, their steps aligned without effort. The music swelled around them, violins lifting the air into something almost tender. Eleanor became conscious of the steadiness of his hand at her waist, the respectful distance he maintained, the quiet confidence with which he guided their turns. "You dance as though the floor belongs to you," she murmured, surprised by her own candor. "Only when my partner permits it," he replied. Around them, speculation thickened. Eleanor could feel it pressing against her like heat. Yet within the circle of the dance, a curious calm prevailed. "You should not have been asked to witness this," he said after a moment, his gaze fixed beyond her shoulder. "No lady should be made an exhibit for the entertainment of the well-fed." His words were quiet, but they carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through her. She realized he spoke from conviction, not gallantry. When the music softened to its close, he did not release her immediately. Instead, he guided her toward the edge of the floor and paused beneath a chandelier whose light scattered across his dark hair like frost. From his coat, he withdrew a small velvet case and placed it gently in her palm. "A trifling heirloom," he said. "It has long awaited a more deserving keeper." Eleanor felt the shape of the object through the fabric, her breath catching before she could conceal it. She opened the case with careful fingers. Inside lay a brooch wrought in silver and pale sapphire, the ducal crest etched with meticulous pride. Gasps rose nearby, audible and unrestrained. The significance of the gift required no explanation. Such an emblem was not offered lightly, nor witnessed without consequence. Eleanor looked up at him, startled beyond speech. He met her gaze without apology, as though daring the room to misinterpret what he intended plainly. A servant approached, bowing with nervous haste. "Your Grace," he announced, loud enough to carry, "the private gallery has been prepared as requested." Eleanor felt the words ripple outward, igniting fresh speculation. She closed the velvet case, her pulse thundering with equal parts confusion and anticipation. The Duke extended his arm once more, his expression unreadable yet resolute. "Miss Whitcomb," he said gently, "shall we continue this conversation where walls are kinder than ears?" The private gallery received them with a hush that felt almost reverent after the brightness of the ballroom. Firelight stirred within a marble hearth, breathing amber into the tall shadows that leaned along the walls. Rain tapped steadily against the high windows, its rhythm gentler here, as though the world outside had lowered its voice. Eleanor paused just beyond the threshold, uncertain whether she had crossed into sanctuary or scrutiny. The Duke closed the door with quiet finality, sealing them within a pocket of warmth and suspended time. For a moment neither spoke. He removed his coat and draped it across a chair with the same deliberation he had shown in every movement since his arrival. Eleanor stood near a long table scattered with framed landscapes, her gloved fingers resting lightly upon the wood as if to steady herself against invisible currents. The velvet case lay in her palm, its weight disproportionate to its size. She sensed that whatever words followed would alter the course of more than this evening. "You are at liberty to leave," he said at last, not turning toward her. "I would not detain you against your comfort." The offer was genuine, and for that reason it disarmed her. "I am not uncomfortable, Your Grace," she replied, surprised to find the truth in her voice. "Only unaccustomed." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both her courage and her candor. When he faced her, his expression held a gravity that felt less like severity and more like careful restraint. "I have known of you for some years, Miss Whitcomb," he began. "Not through idle gossip, but through observation." Eleanor's breath caught, though she kept her posture composed. "When your engagement was first announced, I made inquiries, as is my habit, regarding notable alliances." His tone suggested a mind that catalogued the world with meticulous attention. "I learned enough to admire what I heard, and enough to regret the timing of my knowledge." She felt the words settle between them, delicate as ash. "Regret, Your Grace?" He stepped closer, stopping at a distance that honored propriety yet carried unmistakable intent. "Had you not been promised elsewhere, I would have sought an introduction." The simplicity of the confession struck her with unexpected force. No flourish softened it. No sentimentality diluted its meaning. He spoke as one stating a fact long considered and finally voiced. Eleanor lowered her gaze, not from shame but from the sudden intensity of being seen. I was not aware that my circumstances were of interest to anyone beyond my immediate circle, she said softly. A faint shadow crossed his features. That, Miss Whitcomb, is precisely the injustice. He moved toward the window where rain traced uncertain paths down the glass. You were treated as though your worth depended upon a contract rather than a character. The fire shifted, sending a brief flare of light across the room. Eleanor felt something within her respond to the warmth, loosening a tension she had carried for months without naming. I attended today because absence would have appeared weak, she admitted. I wished to prove that I could endure their scrutiny without complaint. The Duke listened without interruption, his stillness conveying a respect deeper than sympathy. Endurance is often mistaken for acceptance, he said quietly. She considered this, her thoughts moving like cautious footsteps. What would you have had me do? She asked. His gaze returned to her, steady and unflinching. Hold your head as you have done, but never believe that such trials are your due. The firmness of his reply startled her with its certainty. She realized he was not offering comfort but correction, as though restoring a truth she had nearly forgotten. Her fingers tightened around the velvet case. This brooch, she said, lifting it slightly, will cause a storm of speculation. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his mouth. That is not an unfortunate consequence. The remark, delivered without humor, revealed a quiet boldness beneath his reserve. Eleanor studied him anew, sensing layers of intention beneath his composure. He was not rescuing her from humiliation. He was challenging the structure that permitted it. Silence settled again, but it no longer felt uncertain. Eleanor became aware of her own breathing, of the steady beat of her heart no longer racing but firm. You speak as though you carry a personal grievance, she ventured. The Duke's expression darkened slightly. I have little tolerance for spectacles that diminish those who have done nothing to deserve it. He paused, then added, especially when the diminished party possesses uncommon grace. Color rose to her cheeks despite her efforts. She had not expected praise, least of all from a man reputed to offer none. You overestimate me, Your Grace. He shook his head once. I rarely misjudge what I observe. The certainty in his tone felt less like flattery and more like a verdict. Eleanor realized she believed him. The realization unsettled and steadied her in equal measure. He stepped closer again, careful not to breach the invisible boundary between them. You shall not leave this evening as you arrived, he said with quiet resolve. I intend to correct a misapprehension that has lingered too long in this room. Eleanor's pulse quickened, though her voice remained composed. What misapprehension is that? He met her gaze fully, and in his eyes she saw neither coldness nor calculation, but purpose. That you stand alone. They returned to the ballroom together, not hastily, not hesitantly, but with a composure that seemed to part the air before them. Conversation thinned into attentive silence as the doors opened and admitted their quiet alliance. Candlelight trembled across polished floors, catching in the crystal pendants above like frozen rain. Eleanor felt the room's collective gaze descend once more, yet it no longer pressed upon her shoulders with the same cruel weight. The Duke's presence at her side altered the geometry of every stare. Music faltered, then ceased altogether, as if the musicians themselves sensed that something more compelling than melody demanded attention. The bride, radiant and unsettled, watched from her seat with an expression too carefully arranged to be sincere. Harold Benton stood near the center of the room, a glass suspended forgotten in his hand, his confidence loosening into visible strain. Whispers bloomed again, but their tone had changed. Curiosity now outweighed derision. The Duke did not release Eleanor's arm. He guided her deliberately toward the open space at the heart of the gathering, where dancers had recently turned in cheerful patterns. Each step was measured, almost ceremonial, as though he advanced toward an unspoken dais. Eleanor's breath remained steady, though her thoughts fluttered like pages caught in wind. She sensed that this moment, fragile and luminous, would be remembered long after the wedding itself faded into polite recollection. When they reached the center, he turned to face the assembly rather than her. The subtle movement signaled intention more clearly than any raised voice could have done. Guests leaned forward without realizing they had done so. The Duke's expression remained calm, but his eyes carried a brightness sharpened by resolve. Eleanor stood beside him, aware that she was no longer a spectator to humiliation but a participant in something bold and unfamiliar. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice neither loud nor strained, yet carrying with perfect clarity across the hush. I beg a moment's indulgence. The simplicity of the request compelled attention more effectively than command. Several fans paused mid-motion. A servant halted in his path. Even the bride's restless smile stilled into uncertainty. "I find myself obliged," he continued, "to correct a misunderstanding that has been permitted to linger too long within this distinguished company." Eleanor felt the words settle into her like a steadying hand. She realized that he spoke not to defend her reputation, but to redefine it in their hearing. The distinction stirred a warmth beneath her ribs that felt dangerously like hope. His gaze moved calmly across the faces before him, pausing nowhere, avoiding no one. "Miss Eleanor Whitcomb stands here tonight having endured a display of fortitude that should never have been required of her." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Harold's jaw tightened visibly. The bride's fingers curled around her bouquet with delicate tension. "She has been regarded," the Duke went on, "as a relic of a former arrangement rather than as a lady of intelligence, grace, and uncommon dignity." The words were not harsh, yet they carried an unmistakable rebuke. Eleanor felt her breath catch, not from embarrassment, but from the startling relief of being named correctly. The room seemed to tilt, as if perspectives long fixed had been gently but irreversibly shifted. He turned then, not to the assembly, but to Eleanor. The movement felt intimate despite the audience. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, his tone softening without losing its clarity, "I should be honored if you would permit me to make plain what ought never to have been obscured." Her pulse quickened, though her posture remained poised. She inclined her head slightly, granting him silent consent. Facing the room once more, he spoke with deliberate calm. "It is my intention to seek this lady's company with the utmost seriousness and respect. I shall consider it a privilege to court her openly, and I trust that society will extend to her the regard it has too long withheld." Gasps rose like sparks in dry air. Fans snapped shut. Someone exhaled audibly. Harold stepped forward at last, color rising in his face. "Your Grace, this is hardly the occasion for—" The Duke's glance silenced him before the sentence could complete itself. It was not a glare, nor an insult, but a look of such composed authority that interruption felt suddenly absurd. Harold retreated a fraction, his indignation dissolving into something less certain. The Duke inclined his head slightly toward Eleanor, an almost imperceptible gesture that carried profound meaning. "If you will allow it," he said quietly to her, though all could hear, "I should like to escort you from this place as my honored companion." The words hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze, yet none of them wounded her now. They watched not for her collapse, but for her decision. She met his eyes fully, drawing strength from the steadiness she found there. "I would be grateful for your escort, Your Grace," she replied, her voice clear despite the emotion rising within her. A murmur swept the room, no longer edged with cruelty but charged with astonishment. The bride's composure cracked for a fleeting instant, revealing irritation she could not conceal. Harold's expression shifted into something resembling regret. The Duke offered his arm once more, and Eleanor placed her hand upon it without hesitation. Together they turned toward the exit, their departure as deliberate as their arrival. Guests parted instinctively, creating a path that felt less like avoidance and more like reluctant respect. Eleanor sensed the transformation in their attention as tangibly as warmth against her skin. Just before they reached the doors, a voice called her name. Harold's tone wavered between command and plea. Eleanor paused, her fingers tightening slightly against the Duke's sleeve. The room held its breath, suspended between past and present. Slowly she turned her head. The Duke did not. He remained facing forward, his posture unchanged, as though the past had no claim upon the direction he intended to lead her. Eleanor looked at the man she had once imagined beside her in life's quieter moments. His expression now held confusion, pride, and something unspoken that arrived too late to matter. She felt no triumph, only a calm clarity she had not known before. When she turned back toward the doors, the Duke spoke at last, his voice low and even, meant for Harold but heard by all. "A gentleman, sir, knows when his presence is no longer required." The words fell with the finality of a closing gate. And with them, Eleanor stepped beyond the threshold, leaving the echo of her former life behind as the rain whispered against the night beyond. Rain traced bright threads through the lamplight as the carriage door closed with a muted thud, sealing Eleanor and the Duke within a small chamber of warmth and motion. The horses stepped forward, hooves striking the wet cobblestones in a patient rhythm that steadied her breathing. For the first time that evening, the noise of society fell away, replaced by the intimate hush of leather, wool, and rain. Eleanor kept her gaze upon her folded hands, uncertain whether the trembling she felt belonged to exhaustion or release. The Duke removed his hat and set it aside with careful deliberation, as though granting the moment the dignity of unhurried attention. He did not immediately speak. His restraint felt kinder than consolation. Eleanor sensed that he understood the delicacy of what had occurred, that words offered too soon might cheapen what silence preserved. Outside, the lamps blurred into streaks of gold as the carriage turned onto a quieter road. "I did not mean to startle you," he said at last, his voice low and even, "though I suspect I have altered the course of your evening beyond expectation." A faint breath escaped her that might almost have been a laugh. "You have altered more than my evening, your grace." She lifted her eyes then, meeting his gaze across the narrow space. "You have altered how I shall be remembered when I leave it." He studied her with a seriousness that did not intimidate but steadied. "You should never have been remembered for what was done to you," he replied. "Only for what you are." The words entered her like warmth after cold exposure. Eleanor felt her composure soften at the edges, the discipline she had worn all day beginning to loosen. She pressed the velvet case between her palms as though it were an anchor. "I thought I had prepared myself for today," she confessed quietly. "I believed that if I stood still enough, spoke little enough, felt nothing enough, I would pass through it untouched." Her voice wavered despite her effort. "I did not anticipate being seen." The Duke inclined his head slightly. "Being unseen is a cruelty society commits with alarming ease," he said. "I have long found it intolerable." The carriage rocked gently as it passed over uneven stone. Eleanor felt tears gather, unbidden and unfamiliar. She turned her face toward the window, ashamed of the weakness yet unable to contain it. The Duke did not move closer, did not offer a handkerchief, did not intrude upon the privacy of her emotion. His stillness granted her the dignity to weep without spectacle. In that restraint, she found a deeper comfort than any embrace could have offered. When she had mastered herself, she spoke again, her voice quieter but steadier. "Why tonight, your grace? Why before them all?" He considered the question without haste. "Because humiliation thrives in witnesses," he answered. "And so must its correction." Eleanor absorbed this, recognizing the deliberate symmetry of his act. He had not rescued her in secret. He had restored her in public. She opened the velvet case once more and regarded the brooch glimmering within. "This will bind my name to yours in every conversation tomorrow," she said. "It already has," he replied gently. "I would not have placed it in your hand otherwise." His candor startled her into a small, incredulous smile. "You are remarkably certain for a man who claims to be reserved." A faint warmth touched his expression. Certainty and reserve are not incompatible. The carriage slowed as they approached a quieter district lined with darkened townhouses and dripping trees. Eleanor realized with a start that she did not wish the journey to end. The thought unsettled her with its swiftness. "You spoke of correcting an injustice," she said carefully. "Have you done so to your satisfaction?" He regarded her steadily. "Not yet." A silence followed, rich rather than awkward. Eleanor felt the air between them charged with something unspoken, like the pause before a storm breaks or a dawn begins. "Miss Whitcomb," he said at last, her name gentled by his tone, "I would not have you mistake my intentions for gallantry. What I did tonight was not impulse." He held her gaze with quiet resolve. It was the conclusion of a consideration that began long before this evening. Her pulse quickened. "You speak as though you had decided something before I knew there was a choice to be made." He did not deny it. "I decided that if ever the opportunity arose to place myself at your side without impropriety, I would do so without hesitation." The admission settled over her like a mantle, heavy with meaning yet curiously comforting. The carriage came to a gentle halt before her residence, lantern light glistening on rain-soaked steps. Neither moved to open the door. The moment lingered, fragile and luminous. Eleanor realized that whatever she said next would shape not only this night but the days that followed. She drew a careful breath. "You have given me back something I believed irretrievable," she said softly. "Not my pride, for that I guarded, but my place in the world's regard." The Duke listened without interruption. "I cannot repay such a gift with mere gratitude." He inclined his head slightly. "I ask for no repayment." She studied him, noting the strength in his stillness, the gentleness in his restraint. "Then what do you ask?" The question trembled between them like a living thing. His reply came without flourish, spoken with the same calm authority that had silenced a room. "Permission," he said, "to ensure that you never again stand alone where you ought to be honored." Her breath caught. The rain whispered against the carriage roof as though urging her toward courage. "And how would you accomplish that, your grace?" He held her gaze, unwavering. "By asking, at the proper hour and with proper form, whether you would consent to become my duchess." The words did not feel like a rescue. They felt like recognition. Eleanor felt her heart steady into a rhythm that matched the rain, matched the quiet certainty in his eyes. She understood then that this was not the beginning of a spectacle, but the beginning of a partnership forged in respect. A knock sounded softly from outside as the driver waited for instruction. The spell of stillness trembled but did not break. Eleanor placed the velvet case carefully into her reticule and met the Duke's gaze with newfound clarity. "I believe, Your Grace," she said with gentle composure, "that I should like very much to hear that question again when the hour is proper." A warmth, subtle but unmistakable, touched his expression. He opened the carriage door and stepped down first, turning to offer his hand. Eleanor accepted it without hesitation, descending into the rain-washed night with a poise that felt entirely her own. As she reached her door, she paused and looked back. The Duke stood beside the carriage, hat in hand, rain silvering his shoulders, watching her with the same steady attention he had shown from the first moment he spoke her name. In his gaze she saw no urgency, only promise. And for the first time since the invitation had arrived, Eleanor felt not like a woman who had endured humiliation, but like one who had quietly stepped into the beginning of her own legend.